If he were still of sound mind, he wouldn't have put his pen to this. I reached for the salt shaker out of habit. Then I stopped. Not because I heard the sentence, but because I suddenly realized everyone was waiting for me to sign, not waiting for me to finish eating. No one rushed me. No one raised their voice. It was just that no one was looking at me as if I still had the right to say no. The sentence came from my daughter-in-law. And when I looked up, I saw my wife lowering her eyes to the tabletop, as if what needed to be avoided wasn't my question, but my gaze. In that moment, I understood something very slowly but very clearly. I wasn't being opposed. I was being replaced, not with anger but with care, not with force but with words like, "We're just worried about you." I used to think the scariest thing about growing old was when your body stops listening to you. But it turns out there's another fear, when other people start deciding for you and call it love. If you've ever sat in your own home and listened to others talk about your future as if you were just a detail that needed rearranging, then maybe you'll understand why I need to tell this story. Before I continue, tell me where you're listening from. A city, a state, or just a quiet room after everyone else has gone to sleep. And if something in that moment felt familiar, please stay until the end. There are long nights that are easier to breathe through when you don't go through them alone. And there are things that, if you don't say them in time, will be said for you. This story was created with the assistance of AI and edited by humans, intended to offer reflection and human value. It does not encourage imitation. My name is Calvin Monroe. I am 71 years old. I worked as an industrial electrician for nearly 40 years before retiring in a small town in northern Ohio, where winters last longer than morning greetings, and people are used to fixing things themselves before calling for help. There were nights I came home late, my shoes still dusty with cement, my hands smelling of metal and machine oil. Daniel was little then, often asleep on the sofa with a comic book resting on his chest. Elaine would leave the kitchen light on for me, a small sign that no matter how late I came home, someone was waiting. I don't remember how many times I ate dinner alone, standing by the sink, but I remember very clearly opening my son's bedroom door, pulling the blanket up over him, then closing it gently, as if afraid to interrupt the dream of a boy who believed his dad was always there. I'm not telling these things to remind anyone of hardship. I'm telling them because that's how I lived. Do first, think later, and rarely ask for anything for myself. I was used to standing behind the scenes, making sure everything worked smoothly, then stepping back. When you do my kind of work long enough, you learn that people only remember you when the lights go out. When everything is working normally, no one asks who made it that way. The watch I wore that evening was a gift Elaine gave me when I turned 50. It wasn't expensive, but the glass was lightly scratched, the leather strap worn at the edges, signs of years of real work. I took it off before dinner, set it on the table like I always did. When I looked back, it was sitting slightly off to the side, nudged out of its usual place. No one touched it, no one noticed. It just wasn't where it belonged anymore. I know every corner of this house. The outlet in the upstairs hallway shorted once during the winter Daniel was in high school. I rerouted the wiring in the kitchen when Elaine wanted to move the oven. I remember the smell of fresh paint when we first moved in. Remember standing in the garage, holding Daniel in my arms, showing him the light switch. "Dad can fix anything," he used to say, his voice full of trust, as if I were someone who could repair the whole world. Time passed, and that voice changed. Daniel grew up, started his own family. He still calls me Dad, but his tone is different, more careful, more reserved. Not because he no longer respects me, but because certain distances appear naturally, like small cracks in a wall you only notice when the light hits them at an angle. Lydia entered our family life with a smile that was always on time. She remembered my birthday, reminded me to take my medication, asked if I felt tired whenever I stood up a little too slowly. She never raised her voice. She just watched closely. Her eyes didn't rest on me, but on my reactions, as if she were logging every small sign, every moment of hesitation. Elaine began telling me to rest more. "You don't need to push yourself anymore," she said in that familiar voice, the voice of someone who had been by my side for nearly half my life. At first, I took it as care. Then, little by little, I noticed those words appeared every time I wanted to do something on my own. Every time I planned to drive. Every time I meant to handle paperwork. Every time I meant to decide. I don't remember exactly when I started staying silent. Maybe it was the first time I saw worry in Elaine's eyes when I forgot my glasses. Or when Daniel said, "Let me do it. It'll be faster." Silence at first felt like giving in. Then it became a habit. And eventually it became proof that others could believe I was no longer capable of speaking up. That night after dinner, while everyone was cleaning up, I stayed at the table longer than usual. The papers were still there. I lifted one. Dense print, heavy with legal terms. In the lower corner there was a signature. My name. I stared at it for a long time. The handwriting was familiar, but it didn't feel familiar. I couldn't remember when I had signed it. I couldn't remember the setting. I couldn't remember the reason. My heart didn't race. I didn't panic. I just felt a very clear, very cold emptiness open up in the center of my chest. If there were documents with my name on them that I didn't remember signing, how many other things had been decided for me while I thought I was simply resting? I set the paper back down, straightened it, as if returning it to its proper place. But in my mind, a question began to form, slowly, clearly, and impossible to dismiss. That was when I understood. That night wasn't just a dinner. It was the first moment I realized that if I kept silent, the story of my life would be told by someone else. I didn't say anything about the paper that night. I folded it and put it in the desk drawer in the bedroom, where I usually keep electricity bills and old warranty booklets. The drawer closed very softly. In this house, important things lately had all been put away like that. In the days that followed, everything seemed normal enough that, if you weren't paying attention, you'd think nothing had changed. Elaine still cooked on schedule. Daniel still greeted me every morning before work. Lydia still stopped by with coffee or pastries. No one mentioned the paper. No one asked what I was thinking. Only the tone had changed. Elaine began talking about how I should avoid long drives. Daniel mentioned a few accidents he'd read about in the local paper. Lydia turned on a radio program in the kitchen about early legal preparation for old age and asked if I could hear it clearly while I was making coffee. Every sentence made sense. There was nothing to argue with, and because of that, there was no room to object. On Sunday afternoon, they sat around the dining table like always. Lydia brought a thin folder, neatly clipped. Daniel pulled out my chair. Elaine poured water, set the glass in front of me, right where it always was. No one called it a meeting, but everything was arranged as if it were time. "Let's talk things through ahead of time for peace of mind," Lydia said gently. "Just in case." Daniel followed, talking about the law, procedures, how failing to prepare could cause trouble for everyone. Elaine looked at me, smiled, and said nothing. I opened my mouth to ask a very simple question. Prepare for what? But Lydia kept talking. Daniel nodded. Elaine placed the pen on the table right beside my hand. No one waited for my answer. I sat there, listening as the conversation moved forward smoothly, like a train without a driver. I didn't object. I didn't nod either. My silence was enough for everyone to continue. The coffee in my hand grew cold. I looked down and saw the steam had disappeared at some point. I couldn't remember when I'd taken my last sip. My hand still held the mug, but the conversation no longer needed me. About 2/3 of the way through, Lydia turned and looked straight at me. "We're just worried about you." The sentence was set down so lightly that no one felt the need to add anything else. It stood there, complete, needing no proof. I didn't respond. If I said no, I'd be the one rejecting care. If I asked more, I'd be the one causing difficulty. The conversation ended quickly after that. From that day on, I started noticing small things. Not to argue, but to understand when the rhythm of this house had changed. Who brought the papers? Who spoke the final sentence? Who decided when things stopped? I didn't say anything. I wrote things down. In an old notebook, I wrote short lines. Date, time, one sentence. No emotion, just facts. I also tested myself in ways no one noticed. I drove myself to the hardware store nearby, bought a few small items. I remembered every turn. I calculated the change in my head. I called an old friend, brought up a memory from 30 years ago, and he remembered it exactly the same way. Nothing was off. But every time I did this, Elaine would tell me I should rest. Not in a worried voice, in the voice of someone used to being listened to. "You don't need to push yourself," she said. That afternoon, Elaine handed me another stack of papers. She placed them in front of me, along with the familiar pen. She didn't explain much. I flipped through a few pages. Small print, long passages, clauses that all sounded alike. When I looked up, Elaine was staring out the window. I signed. Not because I understood everything, but because I had signed like that so many times throughout this marriage. I trusted the hand that had held me through heavy snowstorms and years longer than any explanation. Only when I stacked the papers neatly did I notice. Those pages had all been reviewed before they reached me. I didn't ask. I didn't say anything that night. I just sat in the room for a long time, opened my notebook, and added one more line. I had trusted my wife absolutely, and I had never imagined there would come a day when that trust would be the very thing that left me outside decisions about my own life. The night was very quiet. Elaine went to bed early. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside. A question, soft, not urgent, just stayed there. If the people closest to you believe you're no longer capable of deciding for yourself, what are you left with besides their silence? The appointment was called routine, but the way they prepared for it told me immediately it wasn't just for show. Lydia arrived earlier than usual, neatly dressed, carrying a thin folder. Daniel drove. Elaine sat beside me in the back seat, her hand resting on my knee for a moment before pulling away. We drove along the road leading toward the outskirts, where a small clinic sat behind a row of pharmacies and laundromats. I had rewired the electrical system in that building more than 10 years earlier. When we walked in, the smell of disinfectant mixed with stale coffee felt exactly the same. The receptionist called my name but handed the clipboard to Lydia. No one found that strange. Lydia signed quickly, nodded, and returned it. I sat down on a plastic chair and looked around the waiting room. An old man stared at the floor. A woman spoke softly to her daughter. No one looked at anyone for long. When it was my turn, Daniel stood first, then came back to pull out my chair. I followed. Not slow, not needing help. The exam room door closed behind us. The doctor was already seated behind the desk, white coat, thin glasses. He spoke quickly, almost without pausing. Date of birth, address, simple numbers. I answered. Enough. Clearly. Before I finished, Lydia stepped in. She added, corrected a few small details, small enough to sound helpful. The doctor nodded and kept writing. I looked at Elaine. She smiled faintly and said nothing. The doctor asked about my old job. I had just opened my mouth when Lydia answered first. He was an industrial electrician, retired a long time ago. Lately, he's been forgetting some of the old details. The sentence was brief, emotionless. The doctor nodded and added another line. I looked down at the desk. The pen was there, but it wasn't pushed toward me. When the doctor asked about finances, I answered directly. I managed them myself. I talked about bills, accounts, familiar numbers. He looked up and nodded. Lydia added calmly, "He's been tired lately. The family has started helping." Helping. The word fell lightly, without friction, needing no further explanation. I didn't argue. I didn't try to add anything. I sat still, looking at the pen, then at my hands. They weren't shaking, but no one asked. There are moments when a person's fate is decided not by truth, but by silence. No one said that out loud, but it hung in the room, cold and clear. The appointment ended quickly. The doctor said a few general things. Keep monitoring, reevaluate later. A sheet of paper was printed and placed directly into Lydia's folder. No one handed it to me. No one said I couldn't see it. Out in the hallway, the noise of the waiting room rushed back. Another name was called. A child cried. Life went on as if the room behind us had never existed. Elaine held my hand. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded. Lydia talked with Daniel about the parking lot. They discussed lunch. No one mentioned the appointment. No one asked what I thought. At the exit, the doctor called Elaine back. "I'd like to discuss a few more things." Lydia stopped. Elaine shook her head. "I'll handle it," she said, then turned to me. "Wait here, okay?" The door closed. I stood in the hallway, looking at the frosted glass. The light inside cast a pale streak. I couldn't hear anything. Daniel stood beside me, hands in his pockets, eyes looking elsewhere. I didn't knock, not because I was afraid, but because I understood this was the moment they were waiting to see whether I would step in. And when that door stayed closed, I knew this appointment wasn't meant to answer whether I was still of sound mind. It was meant to answer something else, whether I was still allowed to be present in decisions about my own life, or only allowed to wait outside. We got home as dusk was settling in. The porch light came on automatically, that familiar warm glow. I had installed it myself when Daniel was little, sitting on my shoulders, asking why light bulbs never slept. Everything was still there. But I stepped inside half a beat slower. Elaine went straight into the kitchen. Lydia said something to Daniel about dinner. I stayed behind in the living room. The armchair was still in its old spot, but the small table beside it was emptier. The TV remote was no longer where it usually sat. The stack of mail had been neatly arranged, so neatly that I didn't notice anything was missing until I realized there was. "You should get some rest, Dad," Daniel said, standing in the doorway. His voice was gentle. "You've been out a lot these past few days." I didn't answer. I didn't sit down either. A few days later, Elaine told me I shouldn't drive anymore. She said it calmly, as if it had already been thought through. "Let Daniel drive," she said. "Or Lydia. There's no rush." I nodded. The next morning, I looked for my car keys. The wooden tray by the door was still there. Empty. I opened the drawer underneath. Nothing. I asked Elaine. She didn't look up. "Where did you put them?" she asked instead. Daniel walked in holding the keys. He didn't look at me. "Dad, don't make this awkward." The sentence came out quickly, cleanly. No explanation, no way back. Daniel locked the drawer. I heard the soft click of metal. No one said it was temporary. No one said it was permanent. The keys just weren't mine anymore. That night, I sat in the garage. The smell of motor oil was still there. I remembered the day I taught Daniel how to drive on the quiet road near the house. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, sweat on his forehead. I pressed my foot on the auxiliary brake and said, "Look straight ahead. The car goes where you're looking." He had gone very far. Inside the house, the changes came steadily. Pills were set out every morning. Appointments were written in Elaine's handwriting and taped to the refrigerator. The things I used most were moved for convenience. I wasn't forbidden. I just had to ask. I didn't say anything. I remembered. One afternoon, I logged into the electric account. The password no longer worked. I tried again. Nothing. Elaine said she'd look at it later. After dinner, I tried again. A short line appeared on the screen. Access has been changed. I stood there in the dark room watching the screen glow. No one had warned me. No one explained. Close to midnight, my phone buzzed. A message from the bank. The balance had changed. Not much, but enough for me to know something had happened without my being told. I set the phone down. I didn't call anyone. I didn't turn on the light. Elaine fell asleep quickly. Her breathing was even, familiar. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time realized something very clearly. A home isn't where you have the keys. A home is where you're still asked. And when that's gone, every door, even if it stays open, begins to close in a different way. I woke very early that day. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't make coffee. I put on my jacket and went straight to the small study at the end of the hallway. It's a room few people go into. I keep it the way I keep an old habit. Everything in its place, no questions needed. I opened the drawer and took out the old financial folders. The edges were worn. The paper had yellowed. I spread them across the desk, arranged by year. No hurry. I wasn't looking for anything specific. There were contracts I remembered clearly, signatures so familiar I didn't need to look twice. But with one thin folder I stopped longer. A clause near the end, small print, roundabout language. I read it again, slowly. The clause didn't strip me of my rights, but it allowed someone else to assist when necessary. I folded the paper and set it aside. That morning, Lydia arrived early. She brought coffee and set it on the table. I nodded in thanks, but didn't drink it. I kept going through the papers. Lydia stood in the doorway watching me. Then she said it directly without circling around. "You should rest. Let us handle the money." I didn't respond. I closed the folders and slid them back into the binder. I looked at her for a second, then bent down and locked the drawer. Lydia smiled. She turned away as if everything had been settled. After she left, I took out my old notebook. The leather cover had darkened with age. I opened to a new page. I didn't write feelings. I wrote dates, times, what happened, passwords changed, car keys taken, papers given to sign after dinner, each line short, no commentary. That afternoon, I went out, alone. I didn't tell Elaine. I didn't call Daniel. I drove to the office of an old lawyer, the one who'd helped me with a small dispute years ago. He recognized me right away, asked a few questions. I handed him some papers. I didn't tell family stories. I didn't say any names. He read very slowly. When he finished, he looked up. "These papers aren't enough to take away your right to decide," he said. I nodded. I didn't ask more. Before I stood up, he added one more thing. "But it looks like someone is moving very fast." I left. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't think much. I just kept a steady speed and looked straight ahead. When I got home, Elaine was cooking. The familiar smell filled the kitchen. She asked if I was hungry. I said yes. No one mentioned what had happened during the day. That night, I went to bed early. I opened the drawer, put the notebook inside, and locked it. Not to hide it, to keep it. Lying in bed, I listened to the sounds of the kitchen below. Everything went on like every other night. But I knew somewhere the pace was being pushed, not by paperwork, but by people. And if I didn't move with it, the most important decisions of my life would be made without me there. Dinner that night was perfectly ordinary. Elaine made the usual soup. Daniel arrived on time. Lydia sat in her usual seat and placed her phone face down on the table. No one mentioned paperwork, banks, or lawyers. and I didn't speak first. I ate slowly, not to savor the food, but to see what would happen when I didn't lead the conversation. Usually, I was the one who asked Daniel about work, asked Lydia about weekend plans. That night, I stayed quiet. The spoon touched the bowl softly. The air in the dining room wasn't heavy, just slightly off, like a table set on uneven legs. Elaine glanced at me a few times. Daniel looked up, then back down. Lydia was the first to break the silence, but not with a question. "I've been looking at some houses on the west side," she said casually, like she was talking about the weather. "Prices are good right now. If we sell this place, we'll have enough left to arrange something more comfortable for you and Mom." The sentence landed on the table, light but precise. No one looked surprised. Daniel didn't object. He just nodded slightly, as if it were an idea he'd already heard. Elaine set her spoon down and waited. I kept eating. I didn't look up right away. Lydia continued, talking about the stairs being a little steep, the garage cold in winter, how it would be less trouble to move somewhere smaller. The reasons were lined up neatly, none out of place. Daniel looked at me, then at Elaine. He didn't say anything. I set my spoon down, not forcefully, no sound. I wiped my mouth, folded the napkin, and set it aside. Then I looked up. "No," I said. One word, no raised voice, no explanation. Oyo, the table went completely silent. Lydia blinked once very quickly. Daniel shifted in his chair. Elaine looked at me as if I'd just said something incorrect in a familiar sentence. "What did you say?" Elaine asked. "I said no," I repeated, same tone. "This house isn't for sale." Lydia smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Don't rush," she said. "We're just talking things through. There's no urgency." "I know," I said, "but I'm not signing." No one spoke right away. Daniel looked down at the table. Lydia tilted her head as if considering a different approach. Elaine took a deep breath. "You're making things harder," Elaine said. Her voice wasn't as steady as usual. "We only want what's best for you." I stood up and carried my bowl to the kitchen. My hands weren't shaking. I set it in the sink and rinsed it. When I turned back, all three of them were still sitting there, waiting. "Maybe," I said, "but from now on, I'm not signing anything else." The sentence wasn't long, but it made Elaine stand up abruptly. "Are you questioning me?" she asked, her voice higher than usual. It was the first time I'd heard anger in her voice, unwrapped from concern. "After all these years?" "I'm just saying I'm not signing," I replied. Elaine turned away and walked quickly into the living room. I heard a drawer open, then slam shut. Daniel stood up and called after her. Lydia stayed seated watching me closely, like an object that had just changed properties. Dinner ended like that. I went into the garage afterward. The air was cool, the familiar smell of metal and oil. On the rack, the old hammer was still there, its wooden handle darkened by sweat and time. I picked it up, turned it in my hand. I had used this hammer to drive the very first nails when I built this house. Every strike had its own sound, solid, real. No one could have done that in my place. I put the hammer back where it belonged. There was a time I thought family was a place without boundaries, a place where you could set everything down without fear of it being taken. I lived that way for a long time. That night, Elaine didn't speak to me. Daniel left early. Lydia said a polite goodbye before she went. No one brought up selling the house again. But I knew, from the moment I said no, everything had shifted into a different state. Night fell. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle. Elaine turned her back to me. There was no argument, no apology, just a new distance, freshly placed between us. I didn't know where this would lead. I only knew that for the first time in a long while, I had drawn a boundary. and their reaction told me more than any explanation ever could. If love needs power to survive, then when that power is touched, can that love still stand? The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Elaine still didn't speak to me. She made breakfast as always, set a cup of coffee on the table, then went straight out into the yard. I finished eating, wiped my hands, and picked up my jacket. "I need to review all the paperwork," I said, not loudly, not looking at anyone. "Today." Elaine stood still for a second, then turned back. "Review it for what?" she asked. "To know where I stand," I said. She didn't stop me. She just nodded, very slowly. I called the old law office and asked for a complete copy of all documents related to the house. They scheduled me for noon. I drove myself there. On the way, I didn't turn on the radio. I kept a steady speed and looked straight ahead. Nothing unusual happened, and that was exactly what told me I was doing the right thing. The office was on the second floor of an old building. The wooden stairs creaked softly underfoot. I climbed them, knocked, and was led into the waiting room. The assistant brought out a stack of files thicker than I expected. I sat down and opened each binder. Some pages were familiar. Some I had never been given time to really see. Lydia arrived not long after me. She walked in with the same posture, the same neat coat, but this time she paused at the door a moment longer. Her eyes moved to the files on the table, then back to me. "This isn't necessary," she said, her voice still smooth. "We've already taken care of everything." "I know," I said, "but I need to see it." Lydia sat across from me. She didn't take out her phone. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers interlaced. It was the first time I'd seen her not busy. We turned the pages together. I didn't rush. I read the fine print carefully. Lydia began talking more, explaining each section, each item. But when I stopped at one page, she went quiet. "This page," I said, pointing. "Who proposed this?" Lydia took a breath. "It was for convenience," she said. "In case—" I asked who, I said. She looked at me, then looked to the side, toward the window facing the street. "I did," she said. I nodded. No notes, no argument. The lawyer came in, greeted us, and sat down. I spoke briefly. I wanted to review the right to sell the house. He listened, nodded, asked a few questions. Lydia tried to step in, but this time he raised a hand to stop her. "I need to hear from him," he said, turning to me. I spoke clearly. I did not agree to sell the house. Not now. Not under the current conditions. I didn't need a long explanation, just the necessary words. The lawyer took out another document, not the one Lydia had brought, a new one. He placed it in front of me, turned directly toward me. "You can sign this," he said. "It preserves your rights, and it pauses any transactions until there's a clear agreement." Lydia looked at the paper. For the first time, I saw worry plainly on her face. Not anger, not disappointment, but something else, like a plan slipping off its track. "You don't have to do this," she said, faster than usual. "We can talk about this again at home." "I am talking about it," I replied. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled slightly. Not much, just enough for me to feel the weight of the moment. I took a breath, set the tip to the paper, and signed. The handwriting wasn't pretty, but it went all the way to the end. Some acts of resistance don't require raising your hand, only refusing to bow your head. The lawyer collected the papers and stamped them. "The right to sell the house is temporarily suspended," he said. "No one can proceed with anything without your signature." Lydia remained seated. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she stood, gave a very slight nod. "All right," she said, "if that's what you want." I didn't tell Daniel, not because I was hiding it, but because I wanted to see how people reacted without advance notice. I went home, put the copy into the familiar drawer, and locked it. Elaine asked where I'd gone. I said I'd handled a personal matter. She looked at me for a moment, then turned away. That evening, Lydia came for dinner. She talked more than usual, laughed at the right moments, asked questions in all the right places. But her eyes were different. Every time I went quiet, she looked at Elaine, then back at me, as if measuring distance. I finished eating, stood up, and went into the garage. The old hammer was still hanging on the rack. I didn't pick it up. I just looked at it for a moment, then went back inside. As I passed the living room, I saw Lydia whispering to Elaine. They both stopped when I appeared. Daniel arrived late, ate quickly, and left early. No one mentioned the house. No one mentioned paperwork. Night fell. I lay in bed, listening to light footsteps in the hallway. Lydia left later than usual. When the door closed, I heard a phone vibrate very softly, then stop. I didn't know who she called. I only knew the call wasn't for me. In the dark, I lay still. No need to think much. I had done what needed to be done. Truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be placed in the right spot, at the right time. And when that happens, the people used to controlling the rhythm begin to show their fear, no matter how well they try to hide it. The atmosphere in the house began to change after the signing that day. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Elaine spoke less. Daniel came home later than usual. Lydia was the opposite. She showed up more, stayed longer, talked more. Meals became shorter. No more polite questions. No more familiar attempts to start conversations. Everyone spoke as if walking on a floor that had just been mopped. Careful, cautious, afraid of slipping. Lydia began to lose patience in ways that were hard to notice unless you paid attention. She pressed more. Phrases like, "just a suggestion," turned into, "it would be better to do it this way." The way she looked at me was no longer measuring. It was as if she were waiting for me to slip. One afternoon, while I was fixing the kitchen faucet, Lydia leaned against the doorframe. Elaine was in the yard. Daniel wasn't home yet. "You know," Lydia said, her voice lower than usual, "this should have been finished already." I didn't turn around right away. I tightened the bolt and wiped my hands on a towel. "What do you mean?" I asked. She paused for a beat, then spoke faster. "I mean, if you'd cooperated earlier, everything would have been easier for everyone. The original plan wasn't supposed to be this complicated." The word plan came out naturally, as if it had been used many times before. Lydia stopped short. I turned to look at her. She pressed her lips together, knowing she'd said too much. I didn't react right away. I poured myself a glass of water and set it on the counter. My hand tightened just enough to make the water ripple slightly. I set it down very slowly. "You said plan," I asked. Lydia shook her head. "I didn't mean it like that. I just mean, everyone wants what's best for you." I nodded, as if I'd heard that line before. I didn't ask more. I didn't push. I turned back to the faucet and kept working. Daniel came home just then. He stood in the kitchen doorway, catching the second half of the conversation. Not enough to understand it all, but enough to sense something was off. He looked at Lydia, then at me. "What's going on?" Daniel asked. "Nothing," Lydia answered quickly. "Just a small misunderstanding." I dried my hands and folded the towel. "Can you help me bring a box in from the garage?" I said to Daniel. Daniel followed me outside. The garage door closed behind us. I didn't speak right away. I opened the box and took out a few old items, setting them aside. "What did Lydia say just now?" Daniel asked. "What did you hear?" I asked back. Daniel hesitated. "She mentioned some kind of plan." I didn't answer immediately. I picked up a small wooden box and set it on the workbench. Inside were a few old bills, some papers I'd kept. "Who do you think this house belongs to?" I asked. Daniel looked around as if the question had caught him off guard. To you and Mom. And who decides when it gets sold? Daniel went quiet. I didn't wait for an answer. I just said, I've suspended all transactions. No one can sign for me. Daniel looked at me, longer this time. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to see where you stood, I said. Daniel lowered his head. I saw the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't a bad person. He was just someone who had let things go too far without stopping in time. I just wanted everyone to be okay, Daniel said. Lydia said if we didn't do it early, it would be complicated later. Complicated for who? I asked. Daniel didn't have an answer. We stood in the garage among the things I had built with my own hands. The old hammer hung on the rack. The wooden shelves were still solid. Nothing here needed replacing. That evening, Lydia ate in silence. She didn't smile much anymore. Every time I set my spoon down, she glanced at Daniel. Elaine sat between us, saying nothing, as if trying to keep everything from breaking apart at the table. As the meal was nearly over, Lydia dropped a line without looking at anyone in particular. If this drags on, it's going to be awkward for Daniel. Daniel looked up. Awkward how? Lydia hesitated for a beat. I'm just worried about him. I looked at Daniel. I didn't say anything. After dinner, Daniel followed me out onto the porch. It was dark. The porch light was on. A light breeze moved through. Dad, Daniel said quietly, I need time. Time for what? I asked. To talk to Lydia, to Mom. I need to understand things better. I nodded. You have time. Daniel exhaled as if he'd just been allowed to stand upright again. He didn't apologize. He only said, Don't decide anything else without me. I didn't promise. I just said, I'm here. Daniel went back inside. I stayed on the porch for a long while. There was no anger, no fear. Just one clear thing. The masks had slipped, even if they hadn't shattered yet. And from that moment on, no one could pretend this was just harmless misunderstanding anymore. Inside the house, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Lydia was getting ready to leave. I heard the door close. A call rang out briefly on the front porch, then stopped. I stood still in the dark, knowing that what had been said today was only part of it. The rest wouldn't come through apologies, but through choices. And Daniel was standing in front of that choice, even if he hadn't said it out loud yet. The next morning, Daniel didn't go to work. He sat at the kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Elaine stood at the sink, washing a plate that was already clean. No one spoke. I put on my jacket, then paused. I'm not forcing you to choose right away, I said, my tone as casual as talking about the weather. This doesn't need to be rushed. Daniel looked up as if he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. He looked at me, then at Elaine. I didn't wait for a response. I stepped out onto the porch and opened the garage door. The car was there, covered in a thin layer of dust. I reached into the locked drawer, took out the key ring, and opened it. The metal made a very soft sound. I carried the keys into the house and set them on the kitchen table, right between me and Daniel. Take them, I said. Drive to work. Daniel looked at the keys as if they were something unfamiliar. He didn't touch them right away. Dad, Daniel began. Not because I need to prove anything, I said. I just want you to know I'm not using that power to hold you here. Daniel reached out, touched the keys, then stopped. The keys lay between the two of us, catching the morning light. A very small moment, but a heavy one. I remembered the day Daniel was little, the first time he was allowed to hold the house keys. He had turned them over in his hand, laughing loudly, as if he'd been given the whole world. I had taught him that keys aren't just for opening doors. They're for coming back. Daniel picked up the keys. He didn't smile. He took a deep breath. I'll talk, he said. Today. I nodded. No more words. Around noon, Lydia arrived. She hadn't called ahead. As she stepped into the house, she looked around as if checking whether everything was still in its place. Daniel stood up immediately. "We need to talk," Daniel said. "Here." Lydia looked at me. I didn't move. I sat down in the chair and placed my hands on my thighs. Elaine leaned against the wall, neither coming closer nor leaving. Daniel spoke slowly, one sentence at a time. He talked about the house, about the papers, about the plan to sell without consent. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use harsh words. He just told the truth the way a son speaks to his wife when he's no longer avoiding it. Lydia laughed briefly, then stopped. "You're overreacting," she said. "I just wanted things to be tidy." "Tidy for who?" Daniel asked. Lydia looked at Elaine, then at me. She opened her mouth but didn't continue. Elaine didn't intervene. She stood there, silent. No explanations, no defense. This silence wasn't to avoid trouble. It felt like a decision. Daniel went on. "Dad isn't selling the house. Not now. Not like that." Lydia stared at Daniel for a long time. Her expression shifted from confidence to calculation. "If you choose that," she said, "then you're choosing his side." Daniel nodded. "Yes." The room was so quiet you could hear the wall clock ticking. Elaine still didn't speak. I looked at her. She didn't look back. Lydia exhaled and stood up. "I need time," she said. "I'll stay at my mother's for a few days." Daniel didn't stop her. He nodded. Lydia went upstairs and packed. Drawers opened and closed. A suitcase rolled across the floor. I stayed seated, not helping, not blocking her. When Lydia came down, she didn't look at me. She said a few short words to Daniel, then went out the door. It closed softly but decisively. Daniel stood by the door for a long time. Then he turned to me. "I know this will have consequences," he said. "Of course," I replied. "Every choice does." Daniel nodded. He tightened his grip on the keys, then relaxed it. Elaine turned away and walked into the kitchen. I didn't know what she was thinking. I only knew she didn't say another word to pull things back to how they were. The afternoon passed slowly. I went into the yard and trimmed a few bushes. Daniel straightened up the garage. Elaine cooked dinner. No one mentioned Lydia. No one mentioned selling the house. But the air had changed. That evening, Daniel sat beside me on the porch. The porch light was on. The air was cool. He spoke quietly. "I'm scared." "I know," I said, "but I couldn't do otherwise." I nodded. Neither could I. When Daniel went back inside, I stayed on the porch alone. I accepted what would come: tension, hard conversations, maybe loss. There are no clean victories in choices like these, only truth and the price that comes with it. Night fell. I heard a car start somewhere on the street. Lydia was leaving. I didn't look after her. I just stood still, knowing that from this day on, nothing would go back to the way it was. And maybe it didn't need to. That morning, I woke earlier than usual. Not from lack of sleep, but because the house was too quiet. A different kind of quiet than before. Not tense, not heavy, just empty. I made coffee and opened the kitchen window. Sunlight hit the wall where I used to hang my old electrical meter. Everything was still there. But it felt as if the house had just been returned to itself. Daniel went to work late. Elaine sat across from me at the table. We ate breakfast in silence. Not the kind of silence meant to avoid each other, but the silence of two people learning how to be together again without pretending. When I stood up to clear my cup, Elaine spoke very softly. "You have an appointment with the lawyer today." I nodded. I didn't ask how she knew. It wasn't necessary. The law office was the same as before. Nothing had changed except me. The files were opened, one folder at a time. Everything moved slowly, at the right pace. No one rushed. No one needed to make a scene. The clauses were read again. The signatures were cross-checked. There were no shocking discoveries, just the truth, clear enough to reset boundaries. "The decision-making authority is still yours," the lawyer said. "Some prior authorizations went beyond their scope. We'll revoke them." I nodded. There was no sense of victory, just something returning to its proper place. That afternoon, Lydia called. I didn't answer. Daniel took the call and kept it brief. When he hung up, he looked at me. "She knows," he said. "All the paperwork. It's no longer valid." I didn't ask more. I went out to the yard and trimmed a few branches. The shears made a steady sound. The wind moved through the fence. The house was quiet, in the way I once thought was simply normal. There were no arrests. No one came knocking on the door. No accusations. Just one person losing legal control, and a family forced to face that. Lydia didn't come back that day. She sent Daniel a short message. No apology. Just said she needed time. That evening, Elaine sat beside me on the porch. We didn't talk about Lydia. She asked if I wanted more tea. I shook my head. She sat still. After a while, she said, "I thought I was doing the right thing." I didn't answer right away. "I know," I said later. That was all. Elaine chose to stay, not with loud repentance, but as a quiet decision. Still, everything was different. No more stacks of papers set out in advance. No more pen pushed toward me. We began asking each other, small questions but necessary ones. A few days later, Daniel said he wanted to move out. He said it in the evening while I was fixing the garage door. "I think it's time," he said. "For me, and for you and Mom." I wiped my hands on a towel and looked at him. "Are you sure?" Daniel nodded. "I don't want things to go back to how they were just because it's convenient." I nodded too. "I agree." Daniel looked at me, a little surprised. I smiled. Not from relief, but because this was a step taken at the right pace. On the day Daniel moved out, I helped him carry boxes to the car. Elaine stood at the doorway watching. She didn't cry. She didn't cling. She just stood there. When the car drove away, the house went quiet again. But this time, the quiet wasn't frightening. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, the old armchair, the reading lamp. I opened my notebook, wrote one final line, then closed it. No need to write more. Not everyone who hurt me did so with bad intent, but that doesn't mean I have to keep staying silent. I didn't see victory in those days, no sense of triumph. Just one thing clearer than before. Justice doesn't need noise to exist. It only needs to be placed in the right spot at the right time. Elaine came in and sat in the chair across from me. "Family, after everything," she said, more like a question than a statement. "What is it, really?" I looked at the house, the porch light, the yard where Daniel used to run and play. "Maybe," I said, "it's the place where each person still has the right to be themselves." Elaine nodded. She didn't say more. That night I turned off the lights early. Before falling asleep, I thought about the question still hanging there. What is family after everything that has happened? I didn't have a complete answer, but I knew that tomorrow morning, when I woke up, the house would still be there, and I would still be here, with my voice. I began living alone in that house after Daniel moved out. There was no announcement, no clear goodbye moment. Just one morning when I woke up, made coffee, and realized there were no familiar footsteps in the house besides my own. The first days passed very slowly. I still woke up at the same time, still opened the kitchen window, still watered the pots on the porch, but every action had no witness. No one asked if I needed help. No one reminded me to take my medication. No one stood behind me when I signed anything. The feeling was both light and empty. The first evening I ate alone, I didn't prepare anything elaborate. A piece of pan-seared fish, some boiled vegetables, a bowl of hot soup. I set the dishes on the table and sat in my usual spot. The chair across from me was empty. The light cast a small, neat pool on the wooden table. I ate slowly, not to savor the food, but because there was no reason to eat quickly. There was no clink of a spoon from the other side, no question asking, "Do you want more?" Just the soft sound of chewing and the steady ticking of the wall clock. I looked up at that clock. It had stopped at some point without me noticing. The second hand was frozen midway, as if time in this house had once been held in place. After the meal, I stood up and carried the dishes to the sink. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't turn on the television. I took my toolbox from the garage and brought the clock down. I set it on the workbench. The glass was cloudy, a few screws loose. I took it apart, cleaned each piece, oiled it, adjusted the gears. My hands worked slowly but steadily. When I put it back together, the second hand started moving again. A very small tick echoed in the quiet room. I sat there for a while, listening to the clock. Not thinking much, just listening. In the days that followed, I grew used to the new rhythm. I went grocery shopping myself, cooked my own meals, decided for myself whether to go out or not. No one objected. No one agreed. I did it, and it was done. Some afternoons I sat on the porch, watching cars pass by. Some evenings I read late into the night. I didn't feel lonely the way people usually imagine loneliness. I just felt calm, a calm that comes at a price. Sometimes I missed Elaine. Not the arguments, but very small things. The way she folded towels. The way she rested her hand on my shoulder when passing by. Those things didn't disappear right away. They lingered quietly, like an old scent in a room that's been closed for a long time. One afternoon, Elaine came back. She stood on the porch for a moment before knocking. I opened the door and looked at her. She was thinner, tired eyes, no makeup. We stood facing each other. No embrace, no touch. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice didn't shake. No excuses. Just a short sentence, spoken when there was nowhere left to hide. I didn't answer right away. I opened the door wider to let her in. We sat down in the living room. No one poured tea. No one turned on another light. The late day light was enough to see each other clearly. Elaine spoke more after that. Not to explain herself, just to recount the choices she had made, the moments when she thought she was doing the best thing. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod. When she finished, the room grew quiet again. I looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand was still moving steadily. "I don't regret it," I said. Just one sentence. Elaine lowered her head. She didn't cry. Maybe she had cried enough already. We sat a little longer, then she stood up. "I'll go," she said. "I just wanted to say that." I walked her to the door. When it closed, I didn't linger. I went back inside and straightened the living room, as if a breeze had just passed through. A few weeks later, I called a real estate agent. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell Elaine. I set an appointment for them to see the house. The agent walked through each room, taking notes, snapping photos. They asked who I wanted to leave the house to. I said no one. "Do you have family?" they asked. "I do," I said, "but I won't leave this house to anyone." They nodded and didn't ask more. On the day I signed the papers to sell the house, I sat alone in a small office. No one stood beside me. No one handed me the pen. I read each page carefully, signed slowly. The handwriting wasn't pretty, but it was firm. When I set the pen down, there was no sense of loss like I'd imagined. Just a door closing, at the right time. On my last evening in that house, I packed very little. Clothes, a few books, the toolbox, the old clock. I went from room to room, turning off the lights. With each darkened room, the house felt a little lighter. I stood on the porch one last time. A light breeze, street lights coming on. I didn't turn back again and again. Once was enough. A few days later, I moved away. Somewhere else. Not large, not tied to old memories. I didn't know how long I would stay there, but I knew that from then on, every decision would have my name on it. The price of standing straight isn't always victory. Sometimes it's a meal for one, an empty house, leaving without anyone holding you back. But in return, every morning when I wake up, I know where I stand. And that, for me, is enough. On the first morning after everything settled, I woke earlier than usual. Not from worry, and not because I had something to do. The house was so quiet I could hear the wall clock marking each second. I made coffee and opened the window, letting the cold air fill the room. No one asked what I planned to do that day. No schedule taped to the refrigerator. No papers waiting to be signed. The feeling was both light and empty. I began living more slowly in a very simple way. Walking around the neighborhood in the mornings, stopping by the familiar grocery store, buying exactly what I needed. No more, no less. Back home, fixing small things in the garage, hands-on work I used to do for others, not to prove anything. Just to remember that these hands still knew what to do when needed. Meals became simple. One person, one plate, no arguments, no phrases like, "It's for your own good." Family was still there, but different. Daniel moved out. He visited me on weekends, sat at the table, asked if I needed anything. I didn't say much. He didn't press. We learned again how to sit in silence together without discomfort. Elaine stayed, but the distance between us was clearer than before. She did her things. I did mine. No hurried touches, no gentle reminders. Some evenings we sat in the same room, each reading something different, and the silence no longer meant concealment. Justice, if it can be called that, arrived very quietly. No loud arguments, no one dragged before the law. Just clauses returned to their proper place. Authorities redefined, signatures that no longer carried weight crossed out. Lydia left, carrying irritation she couldn't quite hide. I didn't walk her out. I didn't hold her back. Everything ended with a short nod, enough to understand we would no longer meet in the same room again. I didn't feel like I had won. Truly, there was no moment when I wanted to clench my fists or breathe a sigh of relief. What remained was a very large quiet, enough for me to hear clearly what I had traded away. The family was no longer whole as before. Trust bore cracks that time would struggle to mend. But I hadn't lost either. I didn't allow myself to be pushed out of my own life by care wrapped too tightly. There were boundaries I understood too late. But without understanding them, I might have lost much more. I learned to say no without long explanations. Learned to be silent when silence was my choice, not something arranged by others. And I accepted that quiet has a cost. That cost is meals for one. Evenings without anyone asking if I'm tired. The knowledge that I'm standing straight, but no longer standing inside the arms of everyone I once loved in the same way. I fixed the old clock, the one that had stopped long ago, changed the battery, adjusted the hands, hung it on the living room wall. The ticking returned, steady, unhurried. I watched it for a moment, then turned away. Time keeps moving. The difference is that now I know where I stand within it. This story, if you've listened this far, is a work of fiction. It was created from fragments of life, very real moments many people have lived through in different ways. It isn't meant to encourage imitation, nor to offer a single correct path. I tell it as a perspective, a distilled experience, to open reflection, not to conclude it. If there is a small gift I can leave after everything I've told, it's a simple reminder. Listen to yourself a little earlier, before that voice is spoken for by things said to be for your own good. And before we close, I want to ask you one simple question. Where are you listening to this story from? A familiar city? A distant state? or just a quiet room after everyone else has gone to sleep. Thank you for staying until the very end. If there was a moment in the story that made you feel less alone, if it touched a memory, a fear, or a thought you've never said out loud, you can share your thoughts in the comments. A short line is enough. If you found this story meaningful, please tap like, so it can reach others who may need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you'd like to continue, along with stories like this. Not to find ready-made answers, but to know that somewhere people are still listening. And no matter where you are in your life, you don't have to go through it alone. Thank you for staying until the end and listening to a story that isn't loud, isn't comfortable, but is very real. The fact that you took the time to hear it through, sometimes that alone is an act of kindness, and I truly appreciate it.